back again now with still Cinema 1. Gilles Deleuze's Cinema 1, the movement image. Now we're going to be starting from, I guess, Chapter 9, the action image, having covered a whole slew of other things. So obviously go check out the previous 2 episodes, because it'd be totally strange if you just jumped right into this one.
No, and it'd be fine.
Part 3.
It'd be fine. This part's better.
I love Part 3. Like, it's the best part. I don't know. It might end up being the best part. Who knows? But thank God I'm here with Christina, because otherwise I'd be totally screwed. And yeah, Christina, who are you?
I'm Christina Burke. I'm a third-year PhD student at the Center for the Study of Theory and Criticism at the University of Western Ontario. I don't think I mentioned the University of Western Ontario the past few times.
I don't think you did.
Yeah, that's okay.
I'll put that in the description.
Yeah, I study cinema and philosophy, particularly the relationship between French New Wave films and the philosophy of the period. I'm also a writer. I've written a screenplay, so I'm also involved in a lot of creative work. And if you enjoy goofs and being horny on Maine, you can hit me up on Twitter at Cello Burke. I'm the same on Instagram if you want to see cute cat pictures. And if you're in London, Ontario, hit me up on Lex.
Cello, like the instrument.
Like the instrument.
Cello Burke.
Yes.
Awesome. All right, so now we're on to the action image, having covered the perception image and the affection image. Moving now naturally into the action image. So what the hell is the action image?
We're finally in a place where things matter.
Because it does. He gives us stuff that makes sense, at least to me.
Yeah, and I think I can solve our naturalism problem.
Okay, good.
From the last one. So realism for Deleuze, and realism is what's going to define American cinema.
Right.
Realism is based on a defined milieu.
Okay. Yeah.
And certain prescribed modes of behavior.
Right.
So people are expected to act a certain way. The characters have a habitus.
Yeah.
And so I think this is in contrast with naturalism in the previous chapter, where the world isn't defined yet.
Okay.
It's nature that hasn't been coded, that hasn't been written.
Right.
So for Deleuze, I think naturalism is this more originary or pure state of the world. And then realism is after the world has been sort of overwritten with certain values.
Okay. Yeah. Fair.
If that helps. If anyone... I wonder if there are people sitting at home going, I know what naturalism means. It means this.
Well, if you do know, leave a comment and explain it, because that would be great.
But yeah, so we're in the realm of secondness now, as opposed to firstness. So secondness refers to things sort of in their proper context, being recognized as an embodiment of certain powers or qualities.
Right.
They're actual. There's a state of things.
Yeah.
And he gives us this formula for the sort of large form, he calls it, of the action image. Situation, action, transformed situation.
Yep.
SAS prime or SAS dash.
Yep.
And so this creates what he's going to, following Peirce, call sin signs, which are sets of power qualities actualized in a milieu.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a little bit more straightforward.
I think so.
And he's also going to introduce the idea of the binomial, which is the dual that takes place in the action images.
Yep.
The large form of the action image always has a dual to it.
Yep.
So right away, he's sort of like, this is a prelude. I'm going to talk about Westerns.
I mean, Western is the best example for this, without a doubt.
Before that, he does talk about documentaries, and particularly the early documentaries of Robert Flaherty, like Nanook of the North, etc. And these are just SAS. There's no transformation. It just shows us a society struggling against these challenges that face it and how they get through it.
Yeah.
And then, so we have the Western, SAS prime.
Yep.
And sort of there's the milieu as this like ambiance or encompasser that has a sort of breadth to it, a civilization, an organization. There's a almost like spirit here, and we see it moving through the sort of Western world. And he contrasts that with a sort of neo-Western where the West sort of becomes civilization.
Right.
And so he talks about John Ford's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance here. That movie is about a senator who's renowned for this historic deed. He killed the bandit Liberty Valance, but he confesses to journalists that it wasn't him who actually did this. It was actually this sort of cowboy type figure. But they all end up deciding that no, we're not gonna reveal the truth of this. The story's too good. That this sort of figure of sort of urbane civilization managed to overcome the outlaw spirit of the West. And so in the large form of the action image, what we see is sort of a dream of community and a community's illusions. And so in kind of American film, it's as teleological as kind of the Soviet film, that there is this sort of higher realization, but that dream is the American dream.
Yeah.
The kind of frontierism. He calls it a genetic universal history. So again, there's this very biological association with the American cinema.
Yeah.
Again, it doesn't really think, it just assumes this is the course of things.
Right.
And he talks about how in certain films there is this desire to constantly rediscover America.
Right.
Which I thought was really funny, because in Ford's films that feels like it's especially the case. That the frontier is this new America each
new
time.
Frontier.
Yeah. And there's a kind
Marlboro Man.
Yeah, there's a real sort of organic quality to this, I think. And then he goes on a bit of a tangent in the next section. He talks about Fritz Lang's M. And he's trying to bring out the idea of the duel here, that M as a film is about a duel between the police and the gangsters to catch this criminal who's acting out of order. And so what we learn about the action image is that there's this gap that exists in it, but this gap is waiting to be filled. It's not just an emptiness. And what he talks about in relation to the action image is that the heroes in them sort of await a people. And here again, Ford. Right?
Yeah.
Like Ford's Westerns, or something like High Noon, or something like that. All these films, there is a lone hero who rises within the community, and then the community is realized through his actions.
Right. And the situation that, we are first presented with necessitates the action.
Yeah.
Like it is in some sense responsible for the action that then changes that situation.
Yes.
In the end.
Yeah. And so he talks about this as a sensory motor schema, that we're constantly moving from like low energy vegetative pole to explosive animal pole.
Yeah.
It's just built into the structure to it. The global situation becomes these micro situations. And then he goes off on this weird thing where, maybe not that weird, but it's strange to me that he starts talking about the actor's studio.
Yeah. I mean, you tell me.
Sure. I know what he's referring to this. He's referring to the films of like Elia Kazan, the early Marlon Brando films, so Streetcar Named Desire, On the Waterfront.
Right. Yeah.
These sort of films. Yeah. And so he talks about how in this style of performance, it's only the inner that counts.
Yeah.
And object and emotion become the sign of this genetic history that he talked about before. But there's still this kind of this permeating situation that calls for these explosions of emotion, right? I think that's what he's getting at there. I didn't completely understand the actor studio reference.
I think so. I think that's fair. And there's no... I couldn't give you any better answer.
Yeah, it's a strange departure because I don't know anyone has viewed that way. I think most people would just talk about Elia Kazan, but he wants to bring in that style of performance and suggest a continuity between the more sort of deliberately performative acting of the 40s and then the method acting of the 50s.
Sure.
That there's still these large forms of the action image. And to a certain extent, I think that's true.
Yeah.
I think as Hollywood sort of collapsed in the 60s, it started to blur a bit more. And so then we get the small form of the action image.
Yep.
Or ASA prime.
So as opposed to SAS, where situation, action, new situation, or SAS prime, new situation. Now we have ASA, action, situation, new action, or action prime. What the hell does that mean? For some reason, okay, tell me if I'm wrong. I couldn't get Blue Velvet out of my head when thinking about this. And the reason for that is because we have this character in this pretty bland world. The situation does not necessitate the action. That the action comes from without that white picket fence situation. The guy finds the thumb or the finger, the ear. Yeah, I'm thinking of Friends. I think with the thumb and the finds the ear. And for me, I was just thinking, oh, okay, we have this action that necessitates this person then moving into this situation that is this deep, dark underbelly of this world. And then I don't know what the new action is at the end. That's as far as I got. That's as far as I got.
Well, it's the character gains a habitus, right? So he starts off very innocent.
Oh, I see.
And then he goes sort of on this journey where he finds this ear and he meets this woman and he engages in this sadomasochistic relationship.
Right.
But then at the end of the movie, he ends up with the sweet, nice girl having gone through that.
Sure.
And so what is kind of affirmed is a very sort of classical mode of behavior.
Right.
But it has to go through this sort of darker situation to get there.
So is that a good analogy? Does that work?
I think the similarities between Blue Velvet and like a detective film really sort of bring that.
Deleuze is interesting.
Yeah. So the detective film is going to be an ASA prime.
Right.
As opposed to a film noir that's not sort of a detective film. Like a Double Indemnity would be a large form.
Yeah.
But the Howard Hawks noirs, like The Big Sleep, are going to be small form because they're detective stories.
Right.
Or at least that's how I read it.
I think that's right.
So, he also talks about the costume film versus the historical film. And
then the burlesque eventually.
Yeah. The costume film I think is really interesting in terms of my own stuff is because reading these two sections, I was like, okay, which one is Little Women?
Okay.
Is Little Women the large form or the small form? And I think it's the small form. I think it's more of a costume film than a historical film in Deleuze's sort of categories. If we're going to talk about it as a movement image.
Yeah.
But that was just something I was thinking about.
That's interesting. I don't know. I won't solve this problem for you.
No, I'm gonna need to work on this more.
I'll take your word for it. It is a small form.
In the section of my dissertation, Greta Gerwig's movement image, I will answer that question. Mm-hmm. Then the section Greta Gerwig's time image. Well, we'll see.
Yeah.
So from here he goes to Hawks, and he talks about this as a kind of skeleton space.
So what are some of Hawks's films again?
Rio Bravo with John Wayne, and sort of it's about John Wayne gathering together a group of people to resist a bunch of bandits who are attacking the town.
Right, very American.
Yes.
I like it. Well, actually, no, I hate it, but I get it.
I think Rio Bravo is a tremendous film.
Is it?
Yes. But these are Hawks' films. Is something happens, and then a situation emerges, and then they necessitate sort of a response to that situation.
Right.
So the action that begins Gentlemen Prefer Blondes is Marilyn Monroe and Jane Russell are looking for a husband. Situation, action, marriage.
Right.
And there's comedy along the way. It's a comedic film.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's what I was kind of thinking of, but he talks about small form westerns here. The most famous example he uses is The Wild Bunch, which again, these are bandits at the end of the West. They don't have a lot going for them. They're the ones acting. They're not responding to a situation.
Yeah.
And then we get the discussion of Chaplin and Keaton and the burlesque.
Yep.
And so he talks about the laughter emotion circuit.
Yeah. I know nothing about it.
Yeah.
I'm familiar. And he makes reference to the Chaplin film City Lights.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that movie.
City Lights is real good.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
For those that haven't seen it, City Lights will make you cry. Like if you think
it'll make you laugh a lot, and then you will cry.
It's something, that City Lights.
Yeah.
But yes, sorry, the laughter
emotion. Yeah. So he comes up with this theory of comedy of the laughter emotion circuit, and for Chaplin, he's really interested in particularly the later Chaplin films when talking comes into them, and he talks about this idea of discourse.
Yeah.
And sort of in Chaplin, there's
like
this,
The Dictator and there's the other one.
Monsieur Verdoux is the one he brings up, and how the sort of the tramp character doesn't function in these films anymore, and Chaplin has to become something else.
Right.
But and he also talks about how Chaplin has a kind of play with machines, and that the characters engage with machines, and the machine creates a problem, and then they have to resolve it. So the famous scene in Modern Times where Chaplin gets eaten by the machine.
After he's working on he's working on the assembly line, and he can't keep up with it, and he's got to follow it along to get. Yeah.
And so this is opposed to Keaton, where Keaton gives a kind of burlesque to the large form. And the general is the most obvious one here. We're in the Civil War. There's this mission that needs to be done. So Keaton undertakes it, but of course it's completely farcical. He's rather inept, but in the end he ends up doing the right thing. He destroys the bridge to prevent the train supply from working. And so with Keaton, it's less of this sort of conflict with the machine and more, again, a kind of machinic assemblage. Machines are kind of part of Keaton's work. So Sherlock Jr., he's part of the film.
Yeah.
There's this interchange between the projector and the character.
Right.
Keaton doesn't have Chaplin's sort of skepticism towards modernity.
Mm-hmm.
And Deleuze has this sort of quote where he talks about the anarchistic machinic versus the communist humanism of Chaplin. And I remember feeling really put on the spot, because if I have to choose one of those, but I like Buster Keaton more than Chaplin.
And I think Deleuze does too.
I think Deleuze ends up revealing that he does too. Maybe just because he's in Beckett's film. I don't know. But yeah, the Keaton analysis. This is where I really like my affection for this book really increased.
Right.
Like I was like, oh, this is fun now. Like we got through your weird early film history, And you're just analyzing American cinema, and you're doing a good job. I'm on board with this.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true though.
Yeah.
It was certainly like it made more sense to me. Especially and the way you said it was, I don't need to make it any better. I'm just reiterating it, like the kind of blending and Buster Keaton with the machines.
Yeah.
And that is for those people maybe not so familiar with Deleuze, a very important thing in his work, because we are machines to some extent. We are comprised of machines, and machines are essentially what we interact with. They have their own autonomy. They have their own kind of patterns, their own ways of being, and we shouldn't forget that, and we shouldn't just subsume them under a big Oedipal umbrella. That's just one, misstep. Anyways,
what work could you possibly be talking about?
Sorry.
We're talking about cinema now.
We're talking about cinema. I'm going to shut up. See, but so long ago, well, not so long ago, when Christina and I talked about first doing this, I remember she said, she was like, I want to talk to someone, maybe not so familiar with the cinema Deleuze, but more into the 1,000 Plateaus and Anti-Oedipus Deleuze. I'm like, I don't know if I said this, but in my head I was like, I don't even know that stuff, so like, I don't know what good I'm gonna be.
No, it's good. I think we've made some good allusions to, let's call it the classic Deleuze or Deleuze and Guattari.
Right, the teasing.
Yeah,
teasing a bit.
Okay, so chapter 11, we get this chapter on figures. We get Eisenstein one more time, but in the figure section, he's really doing this Platonic discussion about the large and the small.
Yeah.
And basically what he's trying to say is that the large and the small are equal in that they're both ideas.
Right, yeah, it's a concept.
So it's something to just be like, they're not.
And we're going to get into the metaphysicians, like, okay.
Yeah.
So at this point, I was like, my brain was fried, and I'm like, trying to read this, and then he introduced that, and I was like, oh no. I do not have enough energy at this point to understand what the hell he's saying. So, what does he mean? What does he mean by they are ideas?
So I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to avoid any privileging of one over the other.
Sure.
We're not supposed to take the large form of the action image as good and the small form as bad, or vice versa.
Yeah.
They're both equally capable of expressing something.
Yeah.
And they can both, I guess, be embodied in someone's work. This leads to his discussion of Werner Hertzog. So you have a film like Aguirre, The Wrath of God, or Fitzcarraldo, or, these are large form films. They're about these explorers braving these South American situations. They're very epic, sort of in their structure. They have this sublime quality, but Herzog also makes films about really small things. And the obvious horrible pun here is even dwarves started small, is the first example Deleuze gives of a Herzog small form film.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
But he also talks about how Herzog's idea of Nosferatu, where Nosferatu is this already withered thing.
Yeah.
And is having to start sort of from an action and is defined by its habitus, not by the sort of situation.
Yeah.
And then he moves into talking about landscape and Japanese cinema. And
which he doesn't say a whole lot about.
No, but we can sort of draw a few connections. So for Kurosawa, this is sort of a large form.
Yeah.
But it's not about just the transformed situation. Kurosawa is interested in a question.
Okay.
Or what he will define as any question, whatever.
Right.
So the example he gives is of the film Ikaru, which I think is sometimes translated as Ikaru and other times translated as To Live in the book, but they're the same movie.
Okay.
And so this is a movie about a sort of low-ranking bureaucratic figure who finds out he's terminally ill And so he decides to use his last days to sort of fund this public park.
Yeah.
And so what we end up learning through the film is this question about what it means to sort of reproduce things or make sure life can keep going.
Okay.
And it's that question that's important. It's not the sort of sentimentality of what he's able to accomplish.
Yeah.
And this is what Deleuze says sort of defines Kurosawa as this circulation, the breath that we found in Ford.
Yeah.
And he doesn't make explicit a sort of connection between Kurosawa and Ford, but that's a very popular sort of reading. Kurosawa was a very big fan of John Ford.
Sure.
And I think you can see a lot in both of them. With Mizoguchi, Kenji Mizoguchi, what you get is sort of a lengthening of the small form. And this is like, he calls it the broken stroke.
Okay.
Or the sort of wrinkled stroke. And he has a line here that I absolutely loved, and I put it on Twitter as soon as I saw it, where he says, the lines of the universe are feminine, but the social state is prostitutional.
Okay.
And this is Mizoguchi's work. There are these women who define the universe, whose actions determine the situations.
Yeah.
But the situation always ends up circumscribing them to a kind of defeat or failure or limit. And so they're very tragic films, Mizoguchi's work.
Yeah.
Sancho the Bailiff, The Life of Oharu. There are others. All of his films are fantastic. They're absolutely beautiful. But I think in that line, Deleuze really captures something about his work.
Yeah.
And he's if you think Japanese film tends to be sexist on the whole, Mizoguchi is one of the few directors who's like, oh no, I know it's bad and I will show you and we will think about this. So as opposed to Kurosawa's very macho samurai cinema, Mizoguchi has a cinema of women and their experience in both feudal and contemporary Japan.
Sure.
And it's absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah.
Just give me a second. So moving on from there, we get to chapter 12.
Here we go.
Crisis of the action image.
What was wrong with the action image?
Oh.
What happens to the action image, Christina? Tell me.
Well, first, are you ready for one of Deleuze's favorite late book twists?
Always.
Thirdness.
Yeah.
Oh, hey. Every chapter of this book is divided into thirds.
Oh, shit. Yeah, there's always 3 sections.
Yeah.
3 sub-chapters.
Yes, because you need thirdness to represent mental relations or thought.
What a Hegelian. I think he's got to dial this back a little bit.
But it's not synthetic.
Sure.
It's not synthetic.
Yeah.
A triad is not there's no negation.
You're right.
Thirdness does not negate
right.
secondness. Secondness does not negate firstness.
Yep. So we're stuck with this thirdness, this kind of love triangle.
Yes.
At the heart of this book.
And it will be in the second one too. Each section is in 3 parts.
You should have waited for that punchline after I'd read that one, and then it would have really blown me away.
But yeah, that's one of my things where I'm just like, oh, you jerk, you.
And this and the Marx Brothers embody this thirdness, this 1, 2, and 3-ness.
Yes,
it all comes down to the Marx Brothers.
It really does. Marx Brothers and Hitchcock.
Yeah, Marx Brothers and Hitchcock.
The 2 poles of thirdness.
Yeah.
So. The Marx Brothers, you have I think it's Harpo who's firstness.
Yep.
Chico who's second, and then Groucho is third.
Yep.
He's the sort of interpretant.
Yep.
But of course, because all 3 participate, they all belong to thirdness.
Right.
And so when he gets into Hitchcock, he comes up with this fascinating thing that everything in Hitchcock is interpretation.
Yep.
And so the criminal kind of always does his crime for the innocent man. I think that's really fascinating. And you can see this in like North by Northwest, The Wrong Man with Henry Fonda. It goes on. The Hitchcock oeuvre is this entirely. And he seems to praise Hitchcock for like acknowledging that there isn't just the director and his film, the public plays a role.
Here we get the spectator.
Yeah, we get the emergence of a spectator. And so we get these sort of very intellectualized feelings on the character's behalf. They're thinking about their situation. And then there's a sort of evolution of relations here. And this can become tragic, as in Vertigo.
Sure.
But oftentimes is kind of like comedic or ends positively. Or you get something like The Birds, which ends in this weird sort of balance between nature and people. And he talks about how in Hitchcock characters become assimilated to spectators. They are watching themselves. Rear Window is the most famous example I can think of here. And this is going to create a rupture in the sensory motor.
Right.
That was so important before. But Hitchcock isn't going to take us there. Hitchcock is fine with mental relations, but he's not going to make them self-reflexive.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to begin to wonder about their situation. So this is the crisis of the action image. It's put to its limit in Hitchcock. The action image is a kind of spectator figure thinking about their situation.
Yeah.
Or in the Marx Brothers.
Yeah, the Marx Brothers resolved it.
Yeah. And so in the second section, he's going to kind of finish up with American cinema.
Yeah.
And so he talks about the kind of fundamental Bergsonism of cinema, the sort of open totality and event in the course of happening.
Right. An Italian neorealism.
Yes, we'll get to that. We're going to close with that. Ish. That and the French New Wave. But he talks about Robert Altman's films, kind of the way the crowd is no longer what it was in earlier films. Like in the Western, the gathering of the crowd was the affirmation of civilization.
Okay, yeah.
In Altman, the crowd is kind of this atomized sort of... We could almost like jokingly call it any group whatever, where it's just like it forms and then it disperses and it's made up of singularities.
Yeah.
And you can follow any of these singularities. And Altman's Nashville is a perfect illustration of this. Like that's what the film is Altman tracks 26 different singularities in this environment. And the situation itself sort of becomes elliptical. This is Taxi Driver. Is the example he gives here, so that the character doesn't really have a purpose. He sort of is torn between suicide or this political assassination, and then he ends up sort of just he ends up in this violent conflict with this pimp, and he becomes a hero, but he wasn't trying to be a hero.
Yeah.
There's this kind of dark irony to it. And so we see how the stroll is taking the place of the journey.
Okay.
It's wandering, not traveling with a destination.
Right.
And the thing that's changed in the later American cinema is that all these ideas seem to be based on or upheld by cliches.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is really troubling for Deleuze, that the problem with the post-war cinema is going to be this endless production of cliches.
Yeah.
And for him, American cinema is only able to get out of these cliches negatively.
Yeah.
So through like parody or through a kind of like irony of Taxi Driver.
Mm-hmm.
It's never going to think
right.
these cliches the way European cinema is going to.
Right.
Or it's never going to resist
Yeah.
the way European cinema is going to. So he's going to kind of leave American cinema behind here, with one sort of notable exception and a name he hasn't said so far in this book. Orson Welles is going to be really big in the time image, and a few classical directors will get us to Welles.
Oh, really? All right.
But yeah, so I think my response to this would be that he's somewhat right about 70s American cinema.
Being cliched or
Being
comprised of
only to
cliches.
negatively extricate itself
Sure.
from cliches. And that
Yeah.
I do think he has a point that the new Hollywood is this reaction to classical Hollywood, and it takes so much of that imagery onto itself and can't get out of it.
Yeah.
That cinema's past, its like birth moment, kind of haunts it perpetually, and that it's still dealing with the same ideas.
Yeah.
What I would say is that in the late 80s, so 4 years after he wrote The Time Image, with the release of Steven Soderbergh's Sex, Lies, and Videotape, and the American independent film movement, is that we do get something like an American Time Image.
Oh, okay.
And I would point to directors like Soderbergh, like Tarantino, like eventually Wes Anderson, and stuff like that, who do things that aren't just the negative sort of dispersal of cliches.
Like parody or... Sure.
That they actually do sort of get to something European with a heavily European influence.
Right, of course.
Or a heavy Japanese influence or whatever.
Right.
There is eventually an American cinema that I think does
But what about Jim Jarmusch?
Perfect example. Yes, absolutely. Jarmusch is part of that generation of American filmmakers. That's sort of the next generation who would finally sort of rid themselves of having to negatively fight these cliches, and whose characters can wander without this resistance.
Yeah.
That they find a kind of like, just using Pulp Fiction as an example, that movie is a movie about cliches. But there's an awareness to it.
Yeah.
And a sense of how the universe can be ordered and how coincidence can emerge. And through its use of sort of its nonlinear narrative and it's these overlapping stories, that they're these forking paths, these sort of crystalline ways of viewing things emerge in Pulp Fiction in a way they didn't in any 70s cinema, really. I think Altman does get pretty close. I think Deleuze is maybe not fair to Altman. But I do think we can talk about an American Time image in especially the sort of post 1989 new American independent cinema.
Right.
And that sort of takes us to the end and Italian neorealism, where in the ruins of Italy after the Second World War, you get this society that is neither fully the enemy, though neither can it claim victory either. So unlike in France, where you have the election of de Gaulle and French nationalism and the myth of the resistance to try and unite the country, in Italy you just have people wandering in the ruins after the war. And so these characters are dealing with the sort of cliches of the new American sort of influence in Europe, but also with the cliches of national identity that no longer function anymore. And they're in spaces that aren't complete. They're collapsed. They're not what they used to be. It's a Rome that is without character.
Right.
And so you get these characters who wander in any space, whatever.
Yep.
and they no longer have the same sense of purpose, and the stories no longer have the same sense of purpose. In Bicycle Thieves, the child and his father go looking for the bike, but then it rains and they get distracted and they go off on this meander, and the story no longer cares about like what the main goal was. It's about trying to see like life.
Yeah.
And so this is going to be really influential on the French New Wave, but they're going to see these same spaces and the same detachment in a much sort of younger group of characters. And these characters are going, like, they don't care what happens to them. Yeah. And you can see this in, like, Godard's work especially, but Truffaut's early films as well. They have experiences, things happen to them, and they observe it. They watch the world happen. Yeah. And so this creates... They're kind of doing false movements. They're not following the roles that are prescribed to them. And... what Deleuze sees here is he talks about a sort of worldwide conspiracy of cliches. That there is this grand sort of conspiracy to distribute roles and have people occupy them. Right. And what this European cinema does is introduces a character, the French New Wave in particular, who doesn't take these roles, who doesn't accept these roles, and who's able to comment on them and exist not necessarily outside them, but with a certain degree of indifference to them. Yeah. And so this starts to resemble a sort of self-reflexive thinking. Okay. The image is considering itself as cliche and resisting it and thinking against it. Yeah. But this is no longer movement. Right. We're no longer... The camera is no longer part of matter seeping into every aspect of life. It is observing someone in thought. It is trying to get at something that isn't in the frame. Yeah. That isn't... There's no way to look with the camera at what we're seeing. We might hear something, but what we're hearing isn't even necessarily predicated on what we're seeing.
So we then must recognize that we're looking at the time image?
Yes.
And we need a whole new frame to understand this?
Yes, so we're beyond movement. And so what cinema...
That's whack.
What Cinema 2 is going to do is be like, here's how you resist a worldwide conspiracy of cliches with film. Right. So I'm going to now go on a crazy thing.
I'm excited.
I assume you and most of your listeners are not familiar with the films of Jacques Rivette. He was a member of the French New Wave. He was a little bit older, and it took him a while to get started into filmmaking, but he's famous for making very long films. Okay. Usually centered around some kind of localized conspiracy. Okay. So his most famous film, that's a lot easier to watch now than it used to be, is called Out One. It's a 12-hour film about two rival theater groups and a conspiracy they may or may not have formed during May 68. Okay. And it's just this amazing thing. That's not a good description of anything. It has these moments where you're just watching theater performers improvise, but it also has these moments where you're watching these characters try and investigate this conspiracy. Right. There's all this internal tension and history between them. There's this, the characters are interpreting what's going on, and the conspiracy sort of ends up amounting to not a whole lot, but it's a conspiracy nonetheless that sort of motivates them. And when I read this final section of this book and he got to this conspiracy of cliches, yeah, I was like, you are writing a Jacques Rivette film as philosophy.
Yeah.
This is philosophy as like crime thriller.
Right.
This is what you're saying is that what if the world is an endless series of cliches?
Yeah, these are the stakes.
Yeah, what if there were signs that resisted them and pointed to ways out, and what if signs that were bad and became a part of it?
Yeah.
And like, how do you wander through this world? How do you make sense of this world? And that to me is just it's bonkers. It's like I can't believe that like this is maybe what I think's really going on here is he's trying to make a film of philosophy.
Yeah.
And I think he ends up making a weirdly very exciting film, but you kind of have to go with him a bit at points.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, what's all this biblical stuff and choosing to choose? And it's like, oh, so when you're not surrounded by cliche, you have this freedom. But when the world becomes cliche, how do we choose to choose? What do we believe in?
Yeah.
How do we find our way out of it? And so this book ends on a cliffhanger where he introduces this conspiracy and he's like,
yeah,
but there's a way beyond it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what I love about this book. Is like, I don't think I'm going to write too many analyses using Cinema One, but as like a setup for what comes next, I think it's phenomenal.
Yeah, you're keeping me in suspense. I feel like I gotta go read it like immediately.
Yeah,
I'm very excited.
Yeah, I don't love the way Cinema 2 ends. It ends a lot like a Jacques Rivette film where it's like, yeah, that conspiracy didn't amount to much, but hey.
There actually wasn't a big threat.
Yeah.
Maybe this book wasn't necessary.
Well, yeah, I think there's different readings of it. We can talk about it when we get there.
Yeah.
But Cinema 1 anyway, in the books.
Yeah.
I guess. I went through a journey reading this because I remember trying to read Cinema 1 before and I got to those affect chapters and I was just like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about this. I'm done. But when I got to the end, when I got to thirdness and I was like, oh, okay, I see the structure of this book now.
Yeah.
And then when I got to the conspiracy of cliches, I was like, oh,
it all came together. For sure.
Oh, this is incredible.
Yeah.
Of course no one can get anything out of this. It's such a particular thing. It's almost better if you treat it as an artwork than if you treat it as like a method.
Oh yeah. Well, no, definitely. When I was reading it, I got nothing from it. Yeah. I got nothing. I was like, I don't know if I should read this as like just like a very specific like taxonomization of like different like auteurs, different like film schools, or if I should take it as like a new way for me to even do fucking philosophy. Like I was.
Well, yeah, there's moments too, because like the movement image, we can talk about movement images that aren't cinema, like
yeah,
and I guess that's what Bergson did, so we don't really need to.
But still, like
yeah, and we can speak about affects.
Yeah,
in tremendous detail.
Oh, for sure.
And people have. Yeah, and it's now kind of tired at this point, if I'm being honest. But for me the sort of the ending where everything just gets ratcheted up to this really intense degree, and he's like, we're going beyond.
Yeah,
this is not where this ends.
Yeah.
And I think back to that thing at the beginning where he talks about the essence of a thing never appears at the outset, but in the middle of its development.
Right.
And it's like, okay, yeah, end of Cinema 1, you introduce the real stakes of what's going on here and what you want to do. And it's like, all right, yes, I got it.
And it's very clear right from the get-go that it wasn't just going to be the movement image. Like, he was very clear. Like, this is the first part. So there could have been some kind of meta quality to that quote. Like,
oh, I think there very definitely was.
It's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I think the way this ends, I will treasure, and I'm gonna go watch some Jacques Rivette films. I got 4 hours to kill, or God, how long his movies are. I don't know. I could watch one of them, probably.
Oh my god. You got anything else?
Yeah, that's everything for now. I can just plug my stuff again.
Yeah, for sure.
Twitter account, Cello Burke. Instagram, Cello Burke. Find me on Lex if you're in London, Ontario. If you're coming to the Film Studies Association of Canada conference, I will be the student liaison for that. So that should be a lot of fun. I'll take everyone to Milos or something. We'll have a good time.
I'll sneak my way into there.
Yeah. Okay. And yeah, hopefully we talk about cinema too, because
I would like to.
I also find it a little bit more useful than I find this book, but I'm curious to now read it as the solution to a grand conspiracy.
I'm happy that you made me privy to that, because reading this I didn't get it in that way, but now I think I'm gonna have a different, or then if I just read the time image, now I'm gonna have a better kind of ground to go into that.
Yeah.
And yeah, all right, great. So if you made it this far, I applaud you. We applaud you. It was great. I guess tune in.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah, really. Thank you for listening. And if you have any comments, you know how to leave them. Then yeah. All right. We'll see you next time. Take care.